say about it?
I haven't read it yet, so I can't comment. Okay, thank you.
Then when you're done with it,
Okay. Good evening. Whoa, it is working now. All right. We have a couple people who have called in that aren't feeling well, so we'll go ahead and start. If you can pass these around, please, Elizabeth. Thank you. Actually, I've got an extra here. Got it. Yeah. We can do that at the break, Jim. I'll get you a copy. Yeah. Now, before we begin, no, the first paragraph, oh, I didn't change the date on it. I'm sorry. It's a mistake. It should be October the 25th. You know, if you've got headers and footers on things, you've got to remember to go in separately and deal with them. So these are the slides for October 25th, and I'll correct that when they go in the online version. You will note, however, that the first two bullet points on these slides are the same as last week's. Why? Because we have to keep in front of us at all times what we're talking about in terms of formal causation in order for any of these arguments to have a framework. So that's just review. But let's start out and recall for a minute that there was some homework. Now, I will tell you that the homework for last week, in terms of syllogisms relating to God, Jim has just shown me one that anticipates the arguments we're going to reach this week. So he's earned lots of brownie points, okay? What else would somebody like to offer in terms of our homework? What was the homework? Okay, what does first cause mean? All right, and you want to throw out a response to that?
I was going to say, in the whole scheme of things, God, and if you're talking about, say, table and say origin.
Okay. Anybody else on what we would conceive of as first cause? The dog ate your homework. Okay. Jim.
That which is not made, but made everything that is.
Okay, your argument is anticipating a little bit of what we're going to talk about tonight, and also is a parallel to an argument made by St. Anselm in the 11th century that's known as the ontological argument for the existence of God. And I'll misquote it here, but it's something along the lines of that which, the greater than which, cannot exist or be imagined. Now let me repeat that. That which, the greater than which, cannot exist or be imagined. And so if we sit there and think back to our slides from last week, we had that little excursus on conceptions of God, and we said that God, one definition or one conception is God is neither an object or a substance alongside other objects or substances in the world. He is pure being or existence itself, utterly distinct from the world in time, space, etc., but underlying all. If God were to not be the creator and sustainer of all would cease to exist. None of the concepts we apply to things in the world, including ourselves, apply to God. For example, God is not literally a person, but it is a concept by which we interact with God. Now, if we can imagine anything at all, quarks, the color purple, Tom, love, you name it, vermin. Those don't two go together, Tom, okay? If we can imagine anything, then we would sit there and say, in order for anything to exist, there has to be a source and summation of everything, right? It's got to come from somewhere. And there has to be an essence of something, if we say love, for example. There has to be a source of all love and a consummation of all love, a source and summation. So under that third description of God I gave you there, a concept of God, God would be the source and summation of all things. And so nothing that could possibly exist except to the extent that it would find its original concept, origin, whatever we want to call it, in God. Which takes us actually to where we are this week. When we looked last week, we used the example, the argument for the unmoved mover, right? And this was because one of the physics involved in deductive reasoning are based on change, motion and change. And so if we say that we can observe things because of motion and change, then what is the underlying cause of any motion and change? And so we went through, and I'll review very quickly, the unmoved mover. And we started out and we said, no potential can make itself actual. Right? An efficient cause outside of the thing itself is needed. Now, this is where this is a review coming in on the 4 types of formal causation. We do not need to prove the origin of an accidentally ordered series, but we cannot disprove an infinite regression. And the examples I gave of accidentally ordered series were whether or not my grandfather had been executed when he was 14, great-grandfather. I wouldn't be here, right, if my great-grandfather had been, shot with everybody else. That's an accidentally ordered series. What we're talking about in the unmoved mover is an essentially ordered series. And we need to get away from our minds so much the concept of tracing backward in time and focus more on tracing, and I put this in quotations, downward simultaneously, that the descended members of the order have no independent causal power. So the examples I gave were a thought that gives rise to the firing of neurons to work a muscle series that allows me to throw a stone, to pick up and grasp and throw a stone. And so the first thing in that essential order of series for the throwing of the stone is the thought. Now, we could actually take it further and talk about atomic forces and strong and weak nuclear forces and how neurons work and how electrical signals get transmitted, and make that as complicated as we want. But to make it simple, if I'm going to throw a stone, I have to think about throwing the stone, I have to pick it up, and I have to throw it. Absent my doing that, the stone does not get thrown. And so the unmoved mover would go back in the simultaneous action of any essentially ordered series and say, well, if Carl doesn't exist, he can't have the thought to pick up the stone. And Carl only exists, and you keep going back and back and back, but not back in time, back in the essential order of creation for how creation exists now at the moment that stone is thrown. That's what we're talking about in essentially ordered series. Not accidental. And we're not worried about a time when the universe did not exist. We're not, worried about what about before the Big Bang, for example, but about existence of the universe here and now. In other words, it's not just that God, in a Christian conception, is just the creator of the world that he created, but he continuously creates. And if he's not continuously underlying all creation, it ceases to exist. We're doing some quick review here, and I'm getting some blank stares. Okay.
And I think like we're all balls on the table, and there's got to be a stick, there's got to be a fire. That would be the first cause of it.
Mm-hmm.
And we basically just go around for those who are deists. The balls are hit once, and it's just left to
How they interact.
How they interact until, of course, they go in the pocket. That's like us going to pray. But others would say no. Each time it stops, the player faces.
That would be a theistic viewpoint. Right. It's a pretty rough analogy, but yes. You're saying first cause, and the example you're actually giving is unmoved mover. That the initiation of the motion of the billiard ball goes back to the stick, goes back to the shooter, things of that sort.
Wouldn't it also be the first cause in that thinking the thought, like you said about the stone, thinking about how I'm going to do it?
Yeah, and what we're going to see tonight is that unmoved mover and first cause are essentially the same thing.
But then it's only through that first hit, not the continuous play.
Yeah, the example of the difference between a deistic frame of reference would be you hit God, the creator, hits the brake, and everything that happens after that is just random interaction, math, whatever. A theistic perspective would say there's some design here because all the balls are supposed to go into the pocket. God intends them to go into the various pockets and directs how they go into the pockets with subsequent shots. Well, just to summarize what we were talking about last week, the stone's potentiality for motion is actualized by the simultaneous actualization of all of the physical forces we observe in creation in order for that stone to be thrown. It's only the first member of any essential series that actualizes anything. The rest are all contingent upon that first motion, right? The first mover in any essential series, therefore, must be unmoved in order to actualize the series. The first mover is pure actuality, pure act, not potential at all. Now, we're going to see the same thing from a slightly different frame of reference in the argument from first cause. And you'll see how they parallel each other. So let's look at that in the slides for this week. Again, when you look at arguments in New Atheism, for example, Dawkins or others would say, that Aquinas is focused on a time when the universe didn't exist, and so you can't go back ad infinitum, which is not at all what Aquinas says. That's just simply a misquotation, misreading, didn't read enough of Aquinas to say that. Aquinas could care less about a time, could not care less, about a time when the universe didn't exist. So if we go back and say Thomas Aquinas is a good, Catholic theologian, so he's, in his day and age, certainly going to take Scripture particularly seriously, and we have the first word in Scripture being what? Beginning, right? In Hebrew, bereshit, beginning. So it's saying beginning. There's a time when everything starts. God created the heavens and the earth. This is going to get people's attention again when we get the Big Bang Theory at the start of the 20th century and say, that looks kind of like beginning at the start of Genesis. And so you could sit there and say, There are multiverses, not just one universe. And things oscillate between the Big Bang and I'll call it the Big Compression. Everything goes back to the same space-time, actuality at a single point that is dimensionless. One could, come up with a theory. These are popular theories, right? That it's a multiverse and things come in and out of existence. None of that matters for this argument. What matters for this argument is the actual universe, that we do exist. Because if we say we could not exist, then we don't care how these arguments work, right? So the question is not whether the universe has a beginning, but why it exists now. Why does the universe exist at all? And when I say now, at any point in time, at any point that we would say that the universe exists, why does it exist? There's nothing about the nature, typo here, it should be the nature or essence of a thing that requires that it exist. Let me correct my slide here so I collect these. Essence and existence are not the same thing. And essence can remain even if a thing ceases to exist. Essence cannot account for the fact that something exists. So let's take an example. Let's suppose that we agree with Plato and say there are forms, and that the essential form of a human being is the immortal soul, right? And that this is actualized into a human being when we combine it with matter. We have a body. But that essence remains when the body is dissolved in death. And that's why the soul is still around, and that's the real essence of the human being. However we define humanity at that point, we could say, well, the essence can be present whether or not it exists in space and time. So I've used 3 people as examples. Queen Elizabeth II exists. I've never met her personally, but there is fairly good evidence of the existence of Elizabeth II. And there is reliable testimony to her existence, and there are people in the world who can touch her and measure her and do things and interact with her, right? So the potential of the human essence is actualized in this particular instance in Elizabeth II. King Arthur, on the other hand, leaving aside that there was probably somebody who was the Dux Britannorum in the centuries between the Romans leaving Britain and the rise of the local kings, King Arthur is possessed of human essence. We describe him with all the traits of a real person, having real interaction and communications and feelings and failings and thoughts and everything else, but as a fictional character. But he doesn't exist. And so the essence is described without existing. Diana, Princess of Wales, did exist, but does so no longer as an actualized human being in this world. The human essence inhabited by her is not presently actualized in this world. Now, I've used the examples of people to draw the distinction between essence and existence. The fact that a thing exists doesn't tell us why it does, right? So let's take examples other than people and come up with something that you can describe to me as the essence of something. It could be a thing. Yeah. Sasquatch. Okay, Bigfoot. Well, actually, if you go to Area 51. No. Okay, flying saucers. Sasquatch. Constructs of the mind. Let's assume people have cleverly made all these things up and hallucinated them. Hallucinations can exist and be frighteningly real to people, right? Okay, nightmares. There is actually a training protocol that is used I know the FBI used to use it, I'm assuming other law enforcement do, that involves virtual reality goggles and the projection of sound and everything, where the example I've seen is you're sitting on, this is to train you what the person you are experiencing or interacting with may be experiencing in a particular clinical psychosis, in a particular psychotic break. And so how you might attenuate how you interact with somebody who's having a psychotic break. And so if you're going through the training protocol, you've got your virtual reality goggles on and everything, and you're riding on a bus. And there are voices saying, the FBI is coming to take you away. And there are large birds of prey that are, coming to the windows and scratching at you. Now, if anybody walks up to you and that's your reality, and it's not just virtual, and touches you and says, you need to come with me, you're probably going to react. And so if I know that you are experiencing a reality that might be very frightening, I might approach you differently, right? Are the birds of prey trying to get at your face through the glass of the bus real? So a hallucination can have an essence that doesn't exist. Dreams have essences that don't exist. Let's take the example of a physical thing, though. And we'll go back to a billiard ball, right? If I put a cubic block of, are they made out of marble? I don't know. If I put a cube of marble that is large enough to contain within its dimensions a sphere of the exact size and density of a billiard ball, we could argue that the essence of the billiard ball is present as a potential in that actualized cube of whatever stone we're using. And that essence exists, but it hasn't been actualized. It's a potential.
So is that the same as like the artist who sees the block of the statue?
Michelangelo sees the form in the block of marble, and he has to free it from there. That would be formal cause, then, to say that the purpose of a billiard ball is to roll along a smooth surface with having a particular mass, particular velocity, and to interact with other masses at particular angular velocities, right?
From a philosophical sense, I always thought essence is something that exists, but and I had trouble with this King Arthur because he wasn't real, but I think I'm helped by thinking of essence as a formal cause, and then I can see this about King Arthur.
This is the argument that Aquinas is basically making. It is a causation argument, which is why we always have to go back to those 4 types of formal causation. So, again, billiard ball. Billiard ball could actually be, have the potential to exist in that cube of material. Does anybody know what billiard balls are made out of? Plastic and bakelite? Okay, all right, but we could certainly come up with a perfect marble sphere out of a cube of marble for the same, for the right dimension, right? And so that sphere can be something that has an essence within that cube but doesn't exist. Now, keep going. Not yet. But once we say it does, you're saying yet, and so the element of time is coming in. Once we say that something does exist at any point in time, we go back through that simultaneous change of essential causation and say, in order for this billiard ball to exist, what do we need? We need 4 forms of causation. And what are they? Go back, and we say the first is the material cause. It's made out of this particular thermoplastic. The formal cause, it has a design. It's a sphere having this size and this mass. It has an efficient cause. Somebody made it. There was a molding machine somewhere that made the thermoplastic, and then a polishing machine that, got it to the right dimensions of smoothness. And then it has a final cause. It was made to do something, to roll across a table and interact with other things in a particular way. If I never use a billiard ball on the table to play billiards, does that make it not a billiard ball?
Or a billiard table.
Some people use billiard tables to dine on, right?
Well, yeah. If never used as a billiard table, is it a billiard table?
The element of design says what's intended for, and you're anticipating one of the objections to first cause. So let's park that one for a minute.
So if someone never plays billiards at all in their life, has no clue what this is, does that mean it still exists in essence? It's just without my long thinking?
Billiards, I think I'll take things hanging on the wall. It's from they will get this big hall to get on the billiard table once a day.
Oh, yeah.
Big ugly moose head or whatever it was. It's a billiard. It's a billiard one.
You need a big rifle to shoot one of them things, right? Yeah. Okay, well, now that we've had the testimony of Jed Clampett, we're in better shape. But look at how these causations work, though. You're worried about final cause, and this is going to be the principal front of argument, final causation. Because it says final cause, the end or purpose of the thing, that for the sake of which the thing is. Now, let's be careful. Does this mean that a billiard ball has, in any sense that we can even conceive of, mindedness, that it exists because it's going to roll across the table and it intends to? No. And so the objections to final causation on the basis of mindedness are missing the point. This ring on my finger is designed to go around a finger, but it doesn't have any sense of saying, I'm designed to go around a finger, and I'm actually supposed to be on Carl's finger and not somebody else's, right? Now, if I take this ring off and give it to somebody else, there will be an immediate efficient cause, my wife, who will alter my essence in some way, right? But let's not confuse final cause with intention and mindedness in the thing itself. When we get to the argument for supreme intelligence, there'll be a different argument there.
So it's only the intent that...
If we say there's a design, that starts looking like there's a designer. Now, let's be careful. We're not in an intelligent design argument here, and we're going to get there in a minute, and distinguish that intelligent design does not apply here. We're going to do that when we get to the argument from supreme intelligence. Let's keep going for a minute. We use the examples of Queen Elizabeth II, King Arthur, and Princess Diana. Now, for the potential inherent in the essence to be actualized in a real thing, so for that potential billiard ball in the block of material to actually become a billiard ball, we have to recall that a potential cannot actualize itself. No spherical part of that cube of material can say, I want to become a billiard ball and become one. Right? Some cause external to the thing is necessary. And that's an efficient cause. Somebody's going to take that block of material and put it on some kind of, forming machine and turn it into a sphere. Or whittle it away until we get a sphere. We do not need to prove the origin of an accidentally ordered series. But we cannot disprove an infinite regression. So the fact that this block became a billiard ball and that block didn't is not relevant to this causation argument. But for an essentially ordered series, that there is a billiard ball here and that it used to be within a cube, for an essentially ordered series, the descended members of the order have no independent causal power. The sphere cannot actualize itself out of the block. Something external to the sphere has to do that. You with me so far? What does not have existence on its own, that it's already a billiard ball, must have a cause. And the principle applies to the universe as a whole. All billiard balls, all blocks, all billiard tables, all moose heads, all hillbillies, everything. Stars, moon, planet, whatever. Therefore, and again, not in terms of beginning here, but in terms of what exists, the universe as a whole must have a cause. This is the first cause. And the term first is misleading because it makes us think of first, second, third. It makes us think of a descent in order of time. And it's just an English translation of a word that means before anything else, that which underlines everything. Think of it as principal cause, prime cause. You've heard prime mover in the unmoved mover argument. So this first cause has to be external to or independent of the universe. The problem that most of our conceptions of God have is that they make God part of creation. Creation can't exist if God is part of creation. Can't exist at all. God has to be external to and independent of creation. In other words, this first cause is pure actuality, pure existence. No potentiality involved at all, pure actuality. For any potential to be realized and actualized, there has to be pure actuality. And however you go through any essentially ordered series all the way back through every kind of measurement you could make, you have to get to something that isn't part of that series in creation. Now, that I've blown your mind a little bit, let's unpack that. Let's think of conceptions of God where we make God part of the universe. And we do it all the time in churches, right? Well, let's just struggle for a minute with the intersection between the mystery of the Holy Trinity and a theological position formerly considered a heresy known as patripassianism, that the Father suffers in the offering of Jesus. Now, we know from Scripture that Jesus says, I'm in the Father and the Father's in me. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Various statements. Nathaniel says, show us the Father and we'll be satisfied, right? So, this is not to question that the Father is completely in the Son and the Son completely in the Father. Let's leave the Holy Spirit aside for a minute just to simplify things a little bit. And we're not saying that Jesus is any less than the Father, right? If we go back to Colossians 2:9, in him was the fullness of the deity pleased to dwell. In Ephesians, Paul, or whoever's writing in his name, says the same thing. The fullness of the deity inhabits Jesus Christ. And so our earliest heresy is what? Arianism, that says Jesus is a created being. First and highest and best of created beings, but there was a time when Jesus didn't exist and God made him. God the Father made him, right? Which is why we get into all the arguments that result in the creed that says, begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father, through him all things were made, etc., etc. Now, Patripassianism would say, well, since Jesus and the Father are one, that means that the Father suffers on the cross. What we call the Father, who we call the Father, suffers on the cross. And we're using a conception there of a person. We say one God in three persons in the Trinity. But it's a concept within creation, person, right? If God is in fact the source and summation of all being, pure actuality, pure being, pure existence, then anything, cross, the human incarnation of Jesus Christ, these are actualities that have been potentialized. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, is a verse that comes after we have already been told, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Nothing came to be except through him. So we've seen that the Word, Jesus, is the same as the Father, but gets actualized in the incarnation, within creation. In order, therefore, for the Father to suffer on the cross, the pure actuality has to be potentialized. Can't work that way. Can't work for the Father to become part of creation. No. No. Why? Of one being with the Father, through him all things were made. One essence, pure actuality. The Godhead deigns to become flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. But person is itself a concept within creation, right? Jesus is fully human and fully divine, and he takes his human nature from his mother, who has been actualized as a human being because of all of the strings of causation through creation that take the essence of being human, humanness, and they become actualized in this instance in the Virgin Mary. Yes, Jim.
And although that's Patripassianism, that's no, it is proper to say God died.
Yes, because Jesus is God
True God.
and experienced
God
death.
the Father died? No. But God died.
Mm-hmm.
God the Holy Spirit died? No.
And in fact, we can find different parts of Scripture where Jesus is described as being raised, or where Jesus is described as rising. This is an argument made by a lot of theologians that since divinity is not something that changes, it can't be subject to suffering. And so it is the fully incarnated human nature of Jesus that is an offering of suffering. Now, Anselm, for example, would also argue that that which is not assumed cannot be redeemed. So, when we have Jesus in Matthew and Mark saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Is this that Jesus is just starting to recite the 22nd Psalm, which ends on a note of triumph, 31 verses later, but he dies before he gets there? Or does Jesus actually experience despair and abandonment on the cross? And the argument of Anselm would be Jesus experiences actual abandonment and despair on the cross in order that that might be redeemed. That which, we can't imagine. If Jesus has descended into hell, then we can say the human experience of being in an oven at Auschwitz has been experienced by the Christ in order to be redeemed by the Christ.
So that suffering, that human suffering that is taken at that moment is the potential for human suffering in the future that won't happen. I mean,
You're bringing time into it.
we can't suffer because Jesus has suffered for us.
Oh, we can suffer. And we can try to, make our suffering a participation in Jesus' suffering and therefore be redeemed in that suffering. Hard to do. But, and Jesus participates in our suffering. Come to me and I will take your burdens, right? Doesn't mean we're going to get cured. Doesn't mean the pain's going to go away. But if we consider our pain to be participating in Jesus' suffering and redemption of the world, is that going to change how we approach our pain? For people of faith, yes. I mean, when there are anointings for healing, it's pretty rare that somebody's cured. It does happen. We do see miraculous cures. But do they experience healing even though they're not cured? Yeah, I've certainly seen that and experienced it myself. So the problem with a lot of the arguments about God, whether it's unmoved mover, first cause, whatever it is, the conception of God behind them that makes God part of this universe. And for unmoved mover and for first cause to make any sense at all using deductive reasoning, God's not part of this universe. Now, that means that inductive reasoning, how we gather data, can never prove or disprove that. There's nothing in the scientific method that can prove or disprove that. And this is where faith starts entering the equation. But we see how faith intersects with reason that just says, deductively, speaking about arguments from motion or arguments from causation, there has to be a first cause for anything to exist and for all to exist at any, that it exists now. Could there have been a time when nothing existed? Suppose so, right? That's not what we're arguing about. We're going to take call it a 5-minute break, and we're going to play more with first cause and look at supreme intelligence as another argument deductively for the existence of God. So, if anybody is watching the video of this and coming from a frankly atheistic perspective, are we going to convert them to Christianity? I doubt it. What I hope we will accomplish in discussions like this is to allow people to witness that you can have faith and not be stupid. You can have faith and not be irrational. And that a strictly atheistic position is not rational. It is not founded on reason. It is much an exercise in the will to believe as the worst form of fideism in Christianity or any other revealed religion. But going back to our pal Antony Flew, the atheist philosopher who came to the conclusion in 2015 that God exists, he came to the conclusion that based on deductive reasoning, God has to exist, but doesn't buy at all any of the arguments from special revelation. So he would agree with these arguments from deductive reasoning, but say that everything, that doesn't mean I have to believe the Bible story of anything. That doesn't mean I have to believe that God chose to send his son, that he was incarnated here, et cetera, et cetera. Special revelation is still a different issue beyond proof of the existence of God. And we'll get there, but that's not the same thing as saying once we start getting people to say, well, logically this works, that doesn't mean they're going to buy our account of how it works. That you're just going to start saying, maybe I have to pay attention to what is being said here and examine it more closely, rather than just dismiss it as a fable or irrational.
So going back to the billiards example, special revelation would be like somebody using a granny stick to hit the ball, and all of a sudden this appears to help God do what he wants.
Or special revelation could be that we have virtual reality goggles on that show us the exact trajectory of the ball once it hits another ball at a particular velocity and angle, and we basically guide the stick exactly down that line and say, this is the way you're supposed to go. That God's saying, here's how you follow me. This is who I am, and this is my will for you. And so it would be being able to visualize all the math of billiards and control for that math, which we try to do with computers if we're going to simulate a game in a video game, right? But that would be to say, make it real. Let's take a break. And thank you, Bobby, for the snack. Oh, thank you, Marianne, as well. be nice, particularly in small bills that are not marked. And okay. Now, we just did 45-minute version, less than 45-minute version of first cause that would otherwise take us weeks, okay? So let's go on and look at supreme intelligence. Because at this point, we're just going to tee up these definitions and arguments, and then we'll come back when we look at causality in another context and say, how does this relate to unmoved mover? How does this relate to first cause? How does this relate to supreme intelligence? And here's the problem with, this is where modern philosophers go nuts the most. If we go back to the 4 types of formal causation, we have material, formal, efficient, and final, right? And final is the end or purpose of the thing, that for the sake of which the thing is. Almost all modern thinkers would say there is no such thing as purposiveness. It's all random. It's all that the billiard balls got moved at the Big Bang and have been moving and interacting just on the basis of math and random interactions since. There is no such thing as purposiveness. So,
the efficient cause has a purpose in mind?
not necessarily. The carpenter would have a purpose in mind, but we can come up with all kinds of efficient causes in a chain of causation that do not have a purpose in mind. And so if Mount Pinatubo erupts and casts how many, billion tons of ash into the air, and this changes the amount of sunlight coming through the atmosphere, and we get cooling, and La Nina shows up and all that. Unless we sit there and say the gods are angry and that's why the mountain's blowing up, we would say the mountain blew up because certain geothermal forces got to this level and it happened. So there was no idea in the mountain's mind to blow up. Mount St. Helens didn't decide to suddenly, off itself. That says a lot. No, in terms of mindedness and design. No, right, and so, in a non-scientific age, and you sit there and you see things happening, you might start saying, somebody's up to something here. How do I make him, her, it happy? Or at least not mad at me, if not happy, right? I mean, just think of all the systems of sacrifice in the history of religions. It's about, who do I want to stay on the good side of, right? Now, if you reject purposiveness and say that it is all random, you have a hard time justifying yourself as a philosopher. Because you seem to have a mind, and you seem to have a purpose in writing or arguing, right? And so the arguments, once you reject purposiveness, become kind of circular. And they end up sort of deconstructing thought and saying, language doesn't really exist or something like that. But here's where we have to be careful. Once we say there is purpose to anything, there is final causation to anything, this is not the intelligent design argument that we alluded to last week from William Paley. The intelligent design argument essentially says, once we observe creation, we find that there are certain things that are irreducibly complex that couldn't just arise on the basis of random interactions. You can't make a human being that's a human being that's simpler than a human being. And so if you do the math with the number of known particles in the known universe and all that, and look at the 6 constants, cosmological constants, you say there's not enough stuff for the math to work on a random basis, for certain irreducibly complex things to happen, and for things to have an essential ordering through time, or even a contingent ordering through time. And so the intelligent design argument says, because of this irreducible complexity of certain things, there has to be a designer. There are God's fingerprints all over things. The problem with the argument for intelligent design, from a deductive reasoning perspective, is it's not deductive reasoning. It's inductive reasoning. And all inductive reasoning can do is give us probabilities. So, whatever thing is irreducibly complex, we can posit the possibility of gathering enough data to prove how it happened randomly or through some undirected force. And this has happened throughout the history of the world, right? We can start saying how things that we used to think just happened spontaneously, we came up with an explanation for that weren't spontaneous. If we go back to Van Leeuwenhoek, developing lenses that allow us to look at a microscopic level and see bacteria, we discover that there are all these little things down there in the water. Now, we don't know enough yet to connect those little things with disease. That's going to take a couple more centuries before people like Pasteur are going to say, these things are actually causing this. We can have associations that start out random, and then we gather enough data through observation to say there's some kind of causation involved here. So Edward Jenner in the 18th century is going to say, people who handle cows a lot, milkmaids, etc., don't get smallpox. And he's eventually going to take the essence of cowpox and come up with the technique of invariolation. Because technically when you inoculate somebody for smallpox, you don't inoculate them. You don't give them a shot. You invariolate them. You pierce an area repeatedly with a lancet with the active ingredient, the pathogen for cowpox on it. And this causes an immunity to arise that makes you immune to smallpox, right? Smallpox is now an extinct disease. It doesn't exist except in some very highly guarded vials in WHO lab and in certain genetic sequence codes that people have filed away. So theoretically you could let smallpox out again and make it work. So you could say that things that appear to be irreducibly complex, you can gather enough data to show that at least there's a probable explanation that doesn't involve design. That's it. So the intelligent design argument fails because you can always come up with more data. And the intelligent design argument that's so popular in evangelical Christianity in the last 20 years basically is quite fairly characterized by Richard Dawkins, one of the few fair statements he makes in his books, as an argument of God in the gaps, that God must exist because we can't explain these things. But you can theorize explanations for things we can't explain. Deductive reasoning is not about intelligent design. Deductive reasoning is sitting there and saying, if there's purposiveness to anything, and we do observe that in most things, then they're directed to something. Purposiveness is directed to a goal. Now, the example I'm giving you here is a heart. We don't have to make it as complex as a human heart, a 4-chambered heart. We could come up with other models of heart. They exist in amphibians, for example. But what does a heart do? pumps blood. Is there any reason for a heart to exist other than to pump blood, however we design a heart? If we take an artificial heart, if we have somebody whose heart is failing and we use an ECMO device on them, an extracorporeal, I forget what the acronym stands for, and we're basically circulating their heart with the blood with a small turbine that we've put into their heart. And these things exist now in our ER procedures in a couple big hospitals. Crazy. The essence of the heart is that device which is circulating the blood, right? That's what a heart's for. Is a heart for anything else? Well, if you're the Wizard of Oz, you would say it could exist to be broken. If you're the Wizard of Oz, you would say it would exist for you to have, how you care for people and, things of that sort. But in reality, is there, from an anatomical and physiological perspective, is there a reason for a heart to exist other than to pump blood, to circulate blood through the body?
Doesn't it do something with oxygen from your lungs too?
It's pumping blood, and the blood has been oxygenated coming from the lung. And so we have the 4 chambers to allow it to pump into the lung to do an oxygen exchange.
So
to come.
It also then does something with the oxygen.
It pumps the blood. The blood has been oxygenated by the lung.
How does the oxygen get into the blood?
Through the lungs.
And
The alveoli in the lungs.
It also separates the oxygenated and non-oxygenated blood, so it serves the purpose of therapy as well.
Right. We get the non-oxygenated blood coming in through the superior and inferior vena cava into the right atrium, which collects that blood, moves it over to the right ventricle, which pumps the blood into the lung, where the CO2 is released and the blood is oxygenated and comes back into the left atrium to be collected to the left ventricle to go out into the aorta to circulate in the body in general, right? But the heart itself, whatever it's doing with the blood that reaches it or leaves it, it's circulating the blood. That's what it's for. Liver changes blood chemistry, doesn't circulate blood.
I know, but does the heart sends it to the liver?
The heart sends it to the entire body. There's no part of the body that the blood reaches that it doesn't reach because of the action of the heart. So if your heart stops, there's no blood getting to your brain, and things go. At the end of the day, no matter what the proximate cause of death is in a human being, the ultimate mechanism of death is that oxygen supply has failed in some key tissue, right? Could be because of a heart attack, could be because of exsanguination secondary to gunshot wound. There's just not enough carrier to go around and take the oxygen with it. But at some point, the oxygen supply has failed and the cells die. So the purpose, the essence, not the essence, the purpose. A heart exists to pump blood. That's what it's for. But this does not mean that the heart is in any sense trying to pump blood. Heart's not thinking, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. And, I got to pump, and I got to be a good heart, and I've got to be the best heart possible, and I'm going to work out, The heart is not trying to pump blood. It doesn't intend to pump blood. It just pumps blood. That's what it's for. But the fact that this thing exists, that it has a function or purpose, points toward a specific goal or end, the pumping of blood. This is a final cause. The goal or end of the heart is to pump blood. That's its final cause. For any end, or purpose for anything to exist, the end or purpose, since it can't be actualized in the thing, the heart's not trying, the heart's not intending, for any end or purpose to exist, it must exist already in a mind. Somebody's got to intend. We're getting there. For the universe as a whole to exist, the final cause for everything in it must exist already in a mind. The very idea of a heart, the very idea of that a heart is there to pump blood, and here's how it does it. So the argument for supreme intelligence is that which orders all things to their end or purpose, and it has to be pure being. For all ends and purposes must exist in this intelligence. You know, if we could posit a concept of God where God never thought of a heart, well, there'd be no hearts. But for a heart to exist, God had to think about it. Thinking is not the right word because it anthropomorphizes God. But the pure being of the concept of heart has to exist somewhere in order to come into actualization.
You said that using thinking is the wrong word, but also isn't mind the wrong word? Isn't that maybe a human construct?
Yeah, I agree with you. Mind is, we're mixing language here because we're struggling, right? So whether we call it supreme intelligence, you know, you have an idea of this supreme mind. But really what it is pure being. Just as we said that first cause is pure actuality, supreme intelligence is pure being. That the concept, the potential concept for anything has to exist in order to be actualized. Jim. We'll get back to you, Tom. Sorry.
Would it be a correct statement to say that the supreme intelligence designs things intelligently?
I resemble that remark. No,
We can assume that the word design is necessary.
You see how we're mixing language here, whether we talk about mind or intelligence or design or purpose or end or final cause or goal. We're talking about for anything to exist, it exists for something. It could be an inert lump of coal, but there's some purpose to being an inert lump of coal, right? That at some point you could be burned and oxidized and made into heat or something like that. But in the meantime, you just might be supporting this stratum of the earth above you. Now, I'm personalizing that when I say you. But when we're talking about a thing, something that is a potential that has been actualized, the potential itself, in order to be actualized, has to exist. The potential, right? The concept of the potential. What the supreme intelligence argument says is that potential, therefore, all potentials, the source and summation of all potentials, is being itself. And so the ways we try to explain this and understand this is by acting like there's a supreme mind that has the ideas of all these things in it. But that's a very rough approximation linguistically. Very rough. Coming back to Tom.
When you look at the causes of the word, the table, the design of the table, everything, it's a bad
Then it's a bad table.
Well, okay, now what if we talk about superior intelligence or this, what if it's just like, you tried, okay, and we'll give you a C plus, you know, for an A for effort, but, you know, the execution of this world is probably going to be, does it have to be
this, well, there are a whole bunch of Far Side cartoons that pursue your point. So you see, this kid with his face covered in black, and it says God as a kid tries to make a chicken in his room, and it's blown up in his face, or shows God making snakes out of clay going, man, these things are a cinch, or something. This is because we have to anthropomorphize things like that to try to understand them. They're just, pure being is beyond our ability to conceive, right? And so if we use words like supreme intelligence or mindedness, it's an approximation. The problem becomes who gets to decide whether something is a good design or not. And so if we go back within the last century and say great bastion of the liberal pantheon in America would be Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. of the United States Supreme Court. In upholding the Commonwealth of Virginia enforcing sterilization on the petitioner in a case before the Supreme Court, because it used to be common that, people had certain defects, they were sterilized, or if they'd had too many babies out of wedlock, they were sterilized. This used to be very common in states, right? And the Supreme Court said, and these were the opening lines in the opinion. Remind me of the style of this case. It's not Loving versus Virginia. That's miscegenation. It's Stark versus Virginia, maybe. But at any rate, the court starts by saying 3 generations of idiots is enough, and the Commonwealth of Virginia can sterilize this individual. 3. And this is the same justice that says, if a man be born halt and awkward, here's how the state can put him in a home against his will. Now, that means that somebody other than God gets to decide the utility of human life. Whether this is life worthy of living in the Nazi phrase, or whether this is life worthy of being born, or whether there is a human essence involved, or whether we can say 3 generations of idiots, so just forcibly, tie the tubes or whatever. Once you start saying there's bad design and that we get to decide it, then things can quickly get problematical. Because this is exactly what the Nazis did in the T4 program. They said, why are these, the phrase in German meant life unworthy of living. Why are we allowing them to consume resources? So the first pushback against the Nazis before the final solution with the Jews was in the T4 program, where people started saying, everybody in the asylums is just not getting visited anymore because they're dead. And why is this ash coming down on the town? In Germany. And so the first real pushback against the Nazis was the Catholic Church, first with the Pope issuing the encyclical Mit brennender Sorge, which is the only encyclical ever written in German. It wasn't written in Latin, it was written for the Germans in German, to be published by the churches in Germany, with burning worry, with burning concern is the title of that, saying, you don't get to decide what life is worth living. No human beings get to decide that. Now, I'm using an extreme example, the Nazis, the T4 program, to say, once we start talking about whether it's good design or not, we're taking the essence of being itself, the supreme intelligence, and reducing that down within creation to say, oh, we get to decide whether this is good design or not. And then there are going to be problems.
Well, we are saying this by saying it is superior and it's intelligent. There's a difference between saying it's worthwhile and saying that there are flaws in the system which we have to look at. But it doesn't mean that you have to get rid of the flaws.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that you are arguing for, forcible sterilization. What I'm saying is, once we start arguing about design in the context of us commenting on design, we're getting away from the idea of supreme intelligence, of saying there is some final purpose in anything. We could say the design of a heart is to pump blood because this heart doesn't have a right ventricle. The design has not been executed properly in how the cells divided and did things, and this individual is not going to live upon birth. And we see examples like that, right? Or we see examples of anencephalic individuals being born. Somebody without a head, without a brain, right? That is not a failure in design. It's kind of a failure in execution. That something interrupted the realization of that design, either genetically or through an environmental cause. Or think of thalidomide with the failure of the long bone growth in limbs. That wasn't a failure of design. It was the thalidomide was interrupting the execution of the design. So when we say a supreme intelligence, yeah, we are talking about a designer in the sense of saying pure being has to exist in order for anything to be actualized. Can we conceive of a thing that could not exist? Well, people try all the time, and it gets hard. So if we come up with The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells, you could, assume that you could have an invisible man, but what would the invisible man not be able to do? See anything. An invisible man would be completely blind because there would be no surface in a retina for light to reflect upon and be absorbed. The light would always pass through it. In fiction, okay, could we think of a two-dimensional being? We can think of two-dimensional geometric figures, on a plane. And back in the 50s in the TV show The Outer Limits, there was a two-dimensional being called Eck that showed up, and you could see Eck this way, but if Eck turned sideways, he just disappeared, right? There's this light coming down the hall and things like that. So we can imagine a two-dimensional being, and the fact that we can imagine it means that the concept can exist, which means that the concept has to exist in pure being. Now, that doesn't mean that that has ever been actualized into a real existing two-dimensional being. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, our cat fights sunbeams, and so I always tell him he's fighting Eck. When you'll get the sunbeam off your watch or your and then he'll chase it around and all that. So he's defending us from Eck. But laser pointers will mess with cats' heads. But it's a real thing to the cat, right? So there are things that don't exist. Okay, I'm going to disappoint you. Unicorns do not exist.
I'm sorry, I have granddaughters, they do too.
Okay, and so we can certainly conceive of a unicorn. People have for many years, right? They exist in the mind as a concept of unicornness. The fact that they haven't been realized, actualized, that we haven't taken a horse and potentiated it into a horse that has a horn coming out of its head. Although there's probably somebody trying somewhere with genetic engineering to say, let's get this rhinoceros gene and put it in. The fact that a unicorn has not been actualized that we can prove in this world doesn't mean that the concept of a unicorn can't exist. It does. And so for the and all the mythology around it, right? And now, a unicorn wouldn't be terribly useful in our day and age, because the real use of a unicorn is that it will be able to identify whether somebody's a virgin or not. And, we're kind of up the creek in 21st century America on that, But we can conceive of a unicorn. So the concept, or let's take a hippogriff. A hippogriff is part griffin, part horse, right? But a griffin itself is eagle in the fore parts and lion in the hind parts. And so, of course, Dante's going to take the concept of a griffin and make it particularly symbolic of the church in a certain sense, right? And we get it in heraldry that way. So all of these, wyverns, griffins, hippogriffs, basilisks, things of that sort, they can exist in the mind. And the fact that they can exist in the mind and that our minds have been actualized means there has to be something in all of existence for the universe to exist that idea could arise. So there's a pure being that's never been actualized as a unicorn. But that's the argument for supreme intelligence. For all ends and purposes to exist must exist in the supreme intelligence. Now, we've covered a lot of ground tonight. We've looked in the last 2 weeks at unmoved mover. We've looked at first cause. We've looked at supreme intelligence. All of these depend on arguments from causation. As soon as you say it's random, you can throw all of these arguments out. Nobody's come up with a satisfactory substitute when you say it's all random. You just make that as a statement of faith. It's all random, man. Nobody's been able to demonstrate that because you can't using inductive reasoning, and deductive reasoning would say it's not random. If it is all random, you can never gather enough data to show that. The amount of data don't exist. So we've gotten so far to the idea that based purely on logic, on deductive reasoning, we can make a plausible argument that what we call God has to exist for there be existence at all. That's not the same thing as saying Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's not the same thing as saying Jesus died for our sins. We're not there yet. But the very concept of God becomes a necessary grounding of existence. Or you have to say we're all hallucinating and it's not real and we're living in the Matrix and things of that sort. That's only as far as we've gotten so far in this course, to talk first about how does deductive reasoning work? What is it? And to look at, how syllogisms work. This is real Cliff Notes version of things that could take, a year in studying formal logic. This is a survey. Moving forward in the course, and we are not meeting next week because next Thursday is All Saints' Day, and we will have a 6 p.m. service for All Saints. We'll meet again on the 8th of November. And so now we're going to look at it from another perspective and say, well, what if it really is all random? How can we know anything? So we're going to look at the problems and positions of materialism and skepticism and look at that from a materialist or skeptic perspective and say, here are the problems with causation. Here are the problems with mind. And here's how it really is all nominalist anyway. There are no essences. They're just what we call things. Let's engage those arguments seriously because we've got to move on from there. How the concept of causation affects the concept of reality. So you got 2 weeks to play with this. Now, I was out of the office 2 days this week. I'm playing catch-up, and so there's an embarrassing number of typos in this and the wrong date on it. And I know there aren't people here, so I'm going to correct slides and issue slides soon, probably tomorrow morning. So you'll all have ones with the right dates on them and less typos. I'm just going to email those to you. If you want them printed, let me know. We'll print them here.
Now, what pages will the...
Just read the whole book. You won't be tested on it next week, but just read the whole book. There is no homework other than to think deep thoughts. And what was it that we called this in The Wizard of Oz? Thinkers of Deep Thoughts, right? Yeah. But they have a diploma. Back where I come from, we have Thinkers of Deep Thought. That's right. Doers